This video shows a variety of data centers and highlights various site conditions that need to be considered in doing containment designs. These first few data centers are ideal in that they have uniform racks and uniform rows, making design relatively simple. Unfortunately, these data centers are the exception. As we look at these other data centers, you can begin to see the various rack heights, gaps, uneven rows, and other obstructions. All of these parameters need to be accommodated when developing a containment design. We will now look at some common conditions that call for extra design effort. The first category of conditions we have to look at are uneven rack heights. So that's not so much a problem when you're hanging curtains from the ceiling because you can trim the curtains to the different heights, but it needs to be accommodated when you're doing the rigid panels across the top. Then of course, lots of times we see uneven rows. So again, when you're putting a door across the end of the row, you need to accommodate that gap between the last rack and where that door is. And then speaking of gaps, notice the box between these two cabinets, and if you look carefully you can see other gaps. We have to deal with gaps between the racks, and then lastly the gaps between the racks and the wall, and you'll see that here. Next is the single-sided aisle. When containing a cold aisle like this one, we have to determine where and how to place a wall opposite of the racks, sort of like shown here in this image. Now in this example, we may want to extend the containment all the way over to the opposite wall, and that's another thing we have to determine. Similar to the single-sided aisle is when we have an aisle that's partially completed, or in this case a row that's partially completed, and we have to determine how we're going to accommodate that and the future growth for that row. Then finally, the cousin to the single-sided row is the perpendicular row. Here we have two rows at right angles to each other, plus a column, so we would have to figure out how to contain that area. The orphan rack is a situation where you have a single rack or a couple racks all by themselves, and again, we have to figure out if and then how we're going to contain those. Here is a particularly difficult area to contain because it's a 10, 12-foot aisle, plus there are columns and air conditioners in the middle of the aisle, so that one's pretty complex. And opposite of the wide aisle is sometimes you get very narrow aisles, and those can be actually a bit easier to contain. An RPP is a power distribution unit that goes at the end of the aisles. And these are particularly difficult to deal with because you can't really attach anything to them or obstruct them. And we see these quite frequently, and they just add, again, more overhead to the design effort. These overhead obstructions that you see above the racks are actually earthquake bracing. We often see unistrut laid across the top of racks in order to support cable trays, so that needs to be accommodated. Notice the big brackets on top of the strut, so you can always use that strut as a supporting surface. Here we see on the blue racks overhead cooling and gray power buses on top of the racks, and lastly some overhead cable trays that span across the aisle. Obstructions come in many varieties here. Pipes and strut at the end of the row obviously make installing a door difficult. The phone is indicative of things like fire extinguishers and first aid kits that often we'd run into. And then columns, typically somewhere in the row like these two examples here. So if you're putting a roof across there, that becomes difficult, and then the gaps between the columns and the racks need to be accommodated. The Cisco 6500 switches have side-to-side air cooling. In this case, it's actually already been fixed, but another thing to look for in terms of making sure that we have hot and cold separated in our design. Of course, cables need to be considered in all designs. We don't want to pinch them. We have to work around them and leave room for them.